we finally come to the end of chapter 17, and we'll finish up looking at what the Industrial Revolution, what effect it really had on Latin America. After independence in the 1820s, Latin American governments they followed a pattern where they started off liberal, who presidents made reforms mostly in things like limiting the power of the church or land redistribution. And then by the 1830s and 40s, you started to see a conservative wave come through, where you had power in the hands of conservative leaders like General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna of Mexico. If you don't know that name, in American history, he was the one that attacked the Alamo. But anyway, most countries of Latin America went conservative. By the 1860s and 70s, they returned to liberal governments who passed a lot of reforms. But by the end of the 1800s, they were back at conservative governments. So it was a very turbulent time where you had those who sought power in like the federal government, kind of like our Hamiltonians and Jeffersonians, and those who wanted more power in the provinces. Central governments like the one in Buenos Aires in Argentina dominated the local regions. You also had debates between liberals and conservatives. Liberals tended to want to restrict the power of the church, and conservatives wanted to protect older institutions like the church. Anyway, a caudillo are strongmen who sometimes seized power and became leaders of their nations. Usually they were local leaders that represented some major interest. So for instance, the caudillos in Argentina represented the cattle interest, or in Mexico sometimes they represented the railroad interests. Some caudillos, like even one in Peru, represented the Native Americans and some of the poor, and tried to make changes. But the vast majority of them represented the Creole elites. And so these caudillos would seize power, and really what you had in Latin America was a wide gap between rich and poor. See, in the United States and in the rest of the industrialized world, you really had a middle class that was growing. These are skilled artisans or manufacturers. And Latin America is really not going to produce much of their own manufacturing, mainly because they don't have that middle class to buy it. The poor aren't going to be able to afford it, and the rich can get whatever they want anyway, especially from overseas. So anyway, what you started to see was the poor feeling kind of destitute and often would revert to revolutionary means. So one such case is the caste war of the Yucatan. The Yucatan Peninsula, while it's probably the most beautiful part of Mexico, it's that part that juts out into the Caribbean. It's often called like the Riviera of Mexico. It's where many Americans go on holiday. So it's the poorest region, really, except for the coast. And it's populated mostly by Mayans. The Mayans have been living there forever. Yet many mestizos had come down and taken land, trying to raise their own crops, and this was encouraged by the Mexican government. And so the Mayans rose up in rebellion. And this is going to happen again and again. I remember at New Year's Day 1900, a group known as the Zapatistas rose up. At 2000. In 2000 they rose up. And it's basically the caste war of the Yucatan all over again. That lasted or smoldered on for a year against the Mexican government. So what really happens is Latin America experiences what's known as the Great Boom. The Great Boom is a period from about 1860, 70 up through the 1900. And so it was a period of great economic prosperity. And it was fueled by the raw materials that Latin America was making or producing. These raw materials helped feed the Industrial Revolution. So each country had its own product. The most interesting one to me is Peru. Off Peru are a lot of islands that nobody lives on, but birds, cormorants really, and they'd been, pooping on those islands for thousands of years. And they found out that this guano, as it's known as, is very, very rich in nitrates. And nitrates help restore nutrients to depleted soils in farmers' fields. And so Peru would send workers to go fill up these burlap sacks with these guano and ship them to the United States and Europe. In fact, the United States actually considered seizing a couple of these islands for their own use before they thought better of it, because guano was so valuable. In fact, guano became their number one export. Chile is rich in copper. Even to this very day, some of the world's greatest copper mines are in Chile. Other items were more consumer-oriented. Now that the middle class of Europe is gaining in wealth, they could afford to eat meat more. Argentina is famous for meat. It's interesting to me that we talk about Brazilian steakhouses like Fogo de Chao, which is a great place if you've ever been. But Argentina is more known for beef than Brazil, although Brazil would produce some beef as well. And what really helps Argentina is the invention of refrigerated ships and steamships. Now they can get the meat from Argentina to Europe without it spoiling. We didn't really import theirs because we have our own. But Europe now could eat more beef. Coffee from Brazil or Colombia, that was very big. Brazil would start producing rubber, which was needed to create hoses or later tires once the industrial revolution leads to the automobile industry or the bicycle industry, which was already big in the late 1800s. Bananas from Honduras, tobacco from Cuba. So each country would start producing goods encouraged by the government to export in return for finished goods. So what you really see is, despite the great boom and the wealth, you're really not getting the industrialization in Latin America that you would see in North America or you would see in Europe. In fact, many of the businesses become owned by foreigners, which is another reason why the caste war, the Yucatan, or many other rebellions occurred. So foreigners would often invest, for instance, in the railroad industry of Mexico or the mining industry. At first they were British that drove the investment, but after the U.S. Civil War, the United States, and then after German unification, even Germany, became major investors in Latin American economies. And many American banks or German banks or British banks lent them a lot of money. So despite the fact that Latin America was producing great wealth, much of this wealth wasn't staying in those countries. And it often led to wars. A good one is the War of the Pacific, where Chile took on Peru and Bolivia for a coastal region of both Bolivia and Peru. And Chile would end up winning this. And this region is very, very rich in nitrates, which are used for a lot of things like explosives. To this day, Bolivia still goes to the World Court suing Chile, trying to get that coastal region back, because Chile has made Bolivia landlocked. Though the World Court ruled Chile can keep it, they have to provide Bolivia access to a port city. So Chile definitely made out on that deal. So there's a lot of foreign capital investment. It often led to wars. Another such war, which I thought was totally unfair, was the war of Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay fought Paraguay. And Paraguay fought well. This was like 1865, 1870, but they ended up losing to their three large, powerful neighbors. And they lost a lot of their land. And Paraguay is another landlocked nation. I always find it interesting because I always read about ex-Civil War soldiers, both Union and Confederate, that fought in this war in Paraguay on both sides. So here you see U.S. interventions. The United States has a long history of intervening in Latin America, and really it was to protect our business interests. You also see on this map the various goods that arrived or exported from each region. And the immigrants that arrived are the red arrows. You can see the vast majority of them went to Argentina. Argentina's population tripled. More than a third of their people were foreign born. Many Italians, but also others. I once watched a globe trekker in Argentina, and each little town in the mountains, one was Welsh, one was German, one was English, one was Russian. So a lot of different people came seeking land and a better way of life. And the picture on the right is guano harvesters on an island off the coast of Peru. So guano would be big. So Latin America wanted to become like Europe because they saw it as being modern and wealthy. And they also thought this would attract more European immigrants. So you start to see large cities. Buenos Aires, the capital of Argentina, is considered the Paris of the South. Broad avenues, beautiful city. In fact, some of the biggest cities in the world, I do believe Mexico City is the biggest city in the world, are in Latin America. It's hard to think that Brazil has two cities larger than any city in the United States. Both Rio and St. Paul are larger than New York or LA. So they asked and they solicited European immigrants. And you can see around 1900, look at all the Italians or Spanish or even Russians or Yugoslavians, Poles arriving in Argentina. So they would try to fuse these cultures, which you can also see in the national dance of Argentina, which is the tango. So it's kind of a European, Latin American beat. But few saw the economic benefits from the exports. Most of those were in the hands of the elites, the foreign bankers, and the investors. But what these new European immigrants arrived bringing was a lot of the revolutionary ideas, socialism, anarchism. The one good news is, with the arrival of immigrants to Brazil, Brazil by the 1880s was free to end slavery. And it diversified Brazil a lot more. So you definitely saw the growth of unions and strikes and protests in countries with a lot of European immigrants and workers like Brazil and Argentina. And it's later also going to lead into the Mexican Revolution, which was a very, very bloody revolution that took place early in the 1900s and was more bloody than the U.S. Civil War. But that revolution was based a lot on European models of revolution, whether social reform and social revolutions. So, though Latin America saw the effects of industrialization, and some of them benefited them greatly, especially the exporters of goods like cattle or copper, rubber, coffee, but the vast majority of the people didn't see great changes in their life, and it would later lead them to forms of protest and rebellion. So Latin America was met with a lot of rural poverty. We talked a little bit about the Mexican Revolution. It's going to be really led by the people. They would form the Constitution that still governs Mexico today. It was groups united. It led to really attacks on Catholic priests and churches, attack on landowners and foreign investors, and really nationalization of major industries. And this dependent development speaks to them being banana republics, which are basically nations dominated by foreign businesses. So, for instance, the Dole Fruit Company dominated like 80% of Honduras' wealth because of the bananas. And the U.S., as we mentioned, would intervene in Latin America many times just in my lifetime, but I don't even know how many, 50 times? Many times just in Haiti alone or the Dominican Republic. So we'll stop with that.